The envelope smelled of decay and time itself, yellowed parchment that crumbled slightly at the edges when Sarah Mitchell's trembling fingers lifted it from the dusty attic floor. She shouldn't have been there. The estate sale wasn't supposed to start until Monday, and here she was on a Saturday afternoon, trespassing in a dead woman's memories. But something had pulled her up those creaking stairs, past the water-damaged portraits and moth-eaten furniture, to this forgotten corner where a leather trunk sat beneath a broken window. And inside that trunk, beneath layers of moth-eaten quilts and faded photographs, was a letter addressed to the one who finds this in handwriting so elegant it looked like lace made of ink. The date read March 15, 1888. Sarah's hands shook as she broke the wax seal, still intact after 138 years, because somehow, impossibly, she knew that whatever words waited inside that envelope were meant specifically for her. She couldn't explain how she knew this. She couldn't explain why tears were already forming in her eyes before she'd read a single word. But as she unfolded the brittle paper and saw the first line, "If you are reading this, then you and I share the same blood, the same burden, and the same choice." Sarah Mitchell's entire world began to crack open like an egg, and everything she thought she knew about her family, her life, and her future came spilling out in ways she never could have imagined. The letter would change everything, but first, it would break her heart. The weight of secrets. Sarah had always believed she was ordinary, painfully, unremarkably ordinary. At 32 years old, she worked as a reference librarian at the Providence Public Library, lived alone in a studio apartment that smelled perpetually of the Indian restaurant downstairs, and had exactly 3 friends who she saw approximately once a month for dinner and obligatory complaints about their jobs, relationships, and the general disappointment of adulthood. Her parents had died in a car accident when she was 19, a grief that had calcified into a dull, manageable ache over the years, and she had no siblings, no extended family, no one who shared her memories of childhood birthday parties or summer vacations to Cape Cod. She was untethered in the way that orphans often are, floating through life without the anchor of family history or the compass of inherited stories, which was why the estate sale had caught her attention in the first place. She'd been scrolling through her phone during her lunch break, mindlessly consuming the local classifieds, when she saw the listing: historic Blackwood estate, complete liquidation, rare books, antiques, personal effects. The address was in the old money part of Providence, where colonial mansions sat behind wrought iron gates and ancient oak trees. Sarah normally avoided estate sales. They depressed her, all those accumulated lifetimes reduced to price tags and bargain hunters. But something about the name Blackwood triggered a strange flutter of recognition in her chest. She couldn't place it, couldn't remember where she'd heard it before, but it hummed in her mind like a half-forgotten song. So on that gray Saturday in March, she'd driven across town to the Blackwood estate, parking her dented Honda Civic among the luxury SUVs of serious antique collectors. The house was a Gothic revival masterpiece, all dark stone and pointed arches, with turrets that clawed at the overcast sky like accusing fingers. A handwritten sign on the front door read, "Sale begins Monday 9 a.m., no early entry." Sarah should have turned around, should have come back Monday with everyone else. But her feet carried her around the side of the house, where a cellar door hung slightly ajar, its rusted lock broken and useless. She told herself she was just looking, just curious. She'd leave before anyone noticed, but once she was inside, once she'd climbed the servants' stairs to the second floor, then up another narrow staircase to the attic, she felt that same inexplicable pull, as though invisible hands were guiding her to the trunk beneath the window, the trunk that held the letter. Now, sitting on the dusty attic floor with the letter spread across her lap, Sarah read words that seemed to reach across more than a century to grab her by the throat. "If you are reading this, then you and I share the same blood, the same burden, and the same choice. My name is Eleanor Blackwood, and I write to you from the year 1888, knowing I will never see the world you inhabit, but praying that you might learn from the mistakes that have haunted our family for generations. You must understand, we Blackwood women have a gift. Some would call it a curse. We can see the paths not taken, the lives not lived, the choices that fork in the road of every moment. And that gift destroys us one by one until we learn to surrender it." I was 17 years old when the visions first came. I was standing in my father's library, reaching for a book of poetry, when suddenly I saw two versions of myself simultaneously, one who took the book and one who didn't. In the first version, I read a poem that inspired me to write my own verse, which I showed to my governess, who encouraged me to submit it to a literary magazine, where it was published, leading to a correspondence with a young editor in Boston, whom I eventually married and loved deeply until his death from tuberculosis 3 years into our marriage. In the second version, I left the book on the shelf, never wrote the poem, never met the editor, and instead married the banker's son my father chose for me. A loveless marriage that produced 4 children and a lifetime of quiet desperation. All of this I saw in the space between one breath and the next. All of this knowledge compressed into a single shattering moment of awareness. And I chose wrong. I chose the banker's son. I chose the safe path, the expected path. Because I was terrified of the grief I'd seen in the other timeline. The young widowhood, the poverty, the struggle of being a woman alone in a world that had no place for such creatures. I thought I was being wise. I thought I was protecting myself. But what I didn't understand then, what I've spent 40 years learning, is that trying to avoid pain only multiplies it. The life I didn't choose haunted me. Every day with my husband was a reminder of the love I denied myself. Every moment with my children was shadowed by the children I never had in that other timeline. The ones who would have carried my poet, who spans gentle soul instead of my banker husband's cold pragmatism. The gift, our gift, is not meant to help us choose the perfect path. There is no perfect path. The gift is meant to teach us that all paths contain joy and sorrow, love and loss, meaning and emptiness. The gift is meant to show us that the choosing itself is what matters, not the outcome. But we Blackwood women keep forgetting this lesson. We see the futures, and we try to optimize, to calculate, to select the path with the least suffering or the most happiness. And in doing so, we damn ourselves to lives of regret and what-ifs. My daughter Margaret inherited the gift. She made the same mistake I did, only worse. She saw a future where she became a physician, one of the first women doctors in America, and she saw the price. Years of struggle, rejection from medical schools, poverty, loneliness, and finally, a small practice in a poor neighborhood where she saved hundreds of lives but never married, never had children, never knew romantic love. She also saw a future where she married young, had a comfortable life, raised 3 daughters, and died never knowing what she might have accomplished. She chose comfort, and it killed her spirit long before pneumonia killed her body at age 53. I found her journals after her death, page after page of anguish, wondering about the lives she might have saved, the difference she might have made. She died believing she'd wasted her one precious existence. Now I am 61 years old, and I am writing this letter as an act of desperate hope. The gift has appeared in our family line for at least 2 centuries that I can document, possibly longer. It appears to skip generations sometimes, or perhaps it simply remains dormant in women who never recognize it for what it is. But if you are reading this, then you have it. You must have it, and you must be struggling with it, as we all have. So I am going to tell you the truth that I wish someone had told me. The visions are not prophecies. They are possibilities. They are the universe's way of showing you that your choices matter, that you have agency, that your life is yours to shape. But they are not instructions. They are not maps to the correct future. Because there is no correct future. There is only the future you choose and the courage required to live with that choice fully, without reservation, without the constant backward glance at the road not taken. I am dying as I write this. The doctors say I have perhaps a month left, and I find myself thinking about that 17-year-old girl in the library, reaching for a book of poetry. If I could go back, would I choose differently? Would I choose the poet and the tuberculosis and the brief, brilliant love? Or would I still choose the banker and the safe, suffocating life I've actually lived? The answer is, it doesn't matter. Both choices would have been valid. Both lives would have contained meaning and purpose and moments of transcendent beauty. The tragedy of my life is not that I chose wrong, it's that I never fully committed to the choice I made. I spent 40 years haunting my own existence, a ghost at my own banquet, always wondering about the feast I'd declined at some other table. Don't do what I did. Don't let the gift become a curse. When the visions come, and they will come in moments of decisio, and both large and small, look at them with curiosity and compassion. Learn from them. But then make your choice based on what calls to your deepest self, not what promises the least pain or the most comfort. And once you've chosen, live that choice with your whole heart. Love the life you're in, not the life you might have had. There is one more thing I must tell you, though it pains me greatly. The gift can be surrendered. There is a ritual, I hesitate to call it that, for it requires no candles or incantations, only a profound act of acceptance and release. You must go to a place where water meets stone, at the moment between day and night, and you must speak aloud the names of all the lives you will never live. You must grieve them genuinely, as you would grieve the death of real people, because in some dimension of possibility, they are real. You are killing them by choosing not to live them. And once you have grieved them properly, once you have honored the weight of your choosing, you must release them. Let them go. Tell them you are choosing this life, this path, this version of yourself, and mean it. After that, the visions will stop. The gift will leave you. You will become like ordinary people, able to see only the present moment and to imagine the future without the burden of experiencing it simultaneously in multiple dimensions. Some of my ancestors did this. I found their journals too. They described it as both a relief and a profound loss, like going blind in one eye. The world becomes flatter, simpler, but also more peaceful. I never did it. I couldn't surrender the gift even though it tormented me. I was too proud, too convinced that I was special. I had been chosen for something important. Now I see that the gift wasn't making me special. It was making me paralyzed. It was preventing me from the simple, sacred act of being fully human, choosing something and living it completely. So I pass this choice to you, dear reader, dear descendant, dear fellow sufferer. Keep the gift and learn to use it wisely, or surrender it and embrace a simpler life. Either path can lead to happiness and meaning, but whichever you choose, please, I beg you, choose fully, live wholly. Don't spend your one wild and precious life as a ghost in your own story. With love across the years. Eleanor Blackwood. March 15th, 1888. Sarah's hands were shaking so badly that the letter rustled like autumn leaves. She read it 3 times, then a 4th, each pass revealing new layers of meaning and impossibility. This had to be a joke, an elaborate prank. Maybe this whole estate sale was some kind of performance art piece, and she'd stumbled into the middle of it. Because the alternative, that this letter was real, that she had inherited some kind of supernatural ability to see multiple futures simultaneously, was absolutely insane. Except for the thing that had been happening to her for the last 6 months. The thing she'd been trying to ignore, to rationalize away as stress or lack of sleep or early onset schizophrenia. The moments when time seemed to split open and show her divergent paths, possible outcomes, alternate versions of her own immediate future. It had started small. She'd be standing in the grocery store, reaching for a bag of coffee, and suddenly she'd see 2 versions of herself. One who bought the dark roast and had a productive afternoon at work, and one who bought the medium roast and spent the afternoon with a headache, unfocused and irritable. She'd dismissed it as her imagination, her brain's way of processing decision-making. Everyone had intuitions about choices, right? Everyone second-guessed themselves. But the visions had gotten stronger, more detailed, more undeniable. Last month, she'd been on a second date with a man she'd met on a dating app, a kind, boring accountant named Derek, who talked too much about his fantasy football league. She'd been sitting across from him at a mediocre Italian restaurant, debating whether to agree to a 3rd date, when the vision had come with such force that she'd gasped aloud. She saw 2 futures, both stretching years into the distance. In the first, she agreed to the 3rd date, then a 4th, then a relationship that was comfortable and companionable if not passionate. They married after 18 months, had a daughter named Claire, moved to the suburbs. Sarah gave up the library job to freelance from home, editing technical manuals and slowly losing her sense of self in the routine of playdates and PTA meetings. Derek was a good husband, a devoted father, but they grew apart over the years, living parallel lives in the same house. When Claire left for college, they looked at each other across the breakfast table and realized they'd become strangers. They stayed married out of inertia and habit, and Sarah died at 79, having lived a perfectly fine, perfectly suffocating life. In the second future, she politely declined a third date. Derek was disappointed but moved on quickly. Sarah stayed single for another 2 years, using on her work at the library, and taking a creative writing class that rekindled her childhood love of storytelling. She published a short story in a literary magazine, then another, then a collection that won a small but prestigious award. She met a woman named Isabel at a book reading, a photographer with wild gray hair and a laugh like wind chimes. They fell in love slowly, carefully, two people who'd both been hurt before. They never married, never had children, but they built a life of artistic collaboration and deep companionship. Sarah died at 79, surrounded by her chosen family, having lived a life that felt authentically, courageously her own. She'd seen all of this, both timelines complete and detailed, right down to the taste of her daughter's first birthday cake in one future, and the feeling of Isabel's hand in hers during a sunset in the other, in the space of about 15 seconds. And when she'd come back to the present moment, Derek was staring at her with concern, asking if she was okay, and she'd realized she was crying. She'd told him she wasn't feeling well and left. She hadn't returned his calls, and for the last month she'd been trying to convince herself that she'd just had a particularly vivid daydream, brought on by anxiety about commitment and the general weirdness of modern dating. But now, holding Eleanor's letter, she couldn't deny it anymore. This was real. The visions were real, and she was part of a family legacy of women who'd been cursed or gifted with the ability to see the consequences of their choices before making them. Sarah sat in the dusty attic for another hour, reading and rereading the letter, trying to absorb its implications. According to Eleanor, Sarah's ancestors had been dealing with this for centuries, and apparently it had driven most of them to lives of regret and paralysis, always wondering about the paths not taken. But Eleanor had also said the gift could be surrendered. There was a ritual, water meeting stone, dusk or dawn, speaking the names of unlived lives and letting them go. Sarah's first instinct was to do exactly that, to get rid of this curse as quickly as possible. She didn't want to see multiple futures. She didn't want to know all the possible consequences of every decision. She wanted to be normal again, if she'd ever been normal in the first place. She wanted to make choices the way regular people did, with incomplete information and hope and faith that things would work out. But something stopped her from standing up and leaving the attic immediately to perform Eleanor's ritual. A small voice in her head, perhaps Eleanor's voice, asking, "What if the gift isn't actually the problem? What if the problem is how you use it?" Sarah thought about Derek and the two futures she'd seen. She'd been so overwhelmed by the visions that she'd fled, unable to make any choice at all. But what if instead of being paralyzed by the information, she'd actually looked at it clearly and asked herself, which of these lives do I actually want? Not which one has less suffering or more happiness, but which one feels true to who I am. And the answer, she realized now, had been obvious. The second timeline, the writing, the creative community, the love with Isabel. That was the life she wanted. Even though it meant staying single longer, even though it meant the vulnerability of pursuing artistic work, even though it meant coming out as queer in her 30s and dealing with all the complicated feelings that would bring up. She hadn't chosen that path because she'd been too afraid to choose at all. But what if the gift wasn't meant to show her which choice was right? What if it was meant to show her which choice was hers? Sarah carefully folded the letter and placed it back in its envelope. She needed time to think, to process, to understand what she wanted to do. But first, she needed to learn more about Eleanor Blackwood and the family she apparently belonged to. She spent the rest of the afternoon searching the attic. She found more trunks, more boxes, more pieces of the Blackwood family history. There were journals dating back to the 1790s, written by women with names like Prudence and Mercy and Constance. There were birth certificates and marriage licenses and death records. There were photographs, faded daguerreotypes and sepia-toned portraits of stern-faced women in elaborate dresses, and running through all of it, like a thread of gold in a dark tapestry, were references to the sight, the knowing, the burden. These women had all known about the gift. They'd all struggled with it, and many of them had written about their experiences, leaving behind a documentary record of what it was like to see multiple futures simultaneously. Sarah found Margaret's journals, Eleanor's daughter, the one who'd chosen comfort over becoming a physician. The entries were heartbreaking. I am 43 years old today. My eldest daughter asked me if I am happy, and I lied to her. I said yes, but the truth is that I see her, my other self, the one who went to medical school, the one who fought and struggled and became Dr. Margaret Blackwood. She is happy. Not always, not constantly, but there is a vitality to her that I lack. She saves a child from diphtheria this week. She holds the mother while she weeps with relief. And I am planning a dinner party. I am selecting the right linens. I am living a life that anyone would call successful, and yet I am hollow inside, a beautiful shell with nothing living in it. Sarah found Constance's diary from 1823. Describing how she'd used the gift to avoid a marriage that would have been disastrous, choosing instead to remain unmarried and open a school for girls, a choice that brought her deep satisfaction despite the social stigma. She found Prudence's letters from 1798, written to a sister who'd apparently surrendered the gift. Prudence had kept it, learned to use it, and described it as both exhausting and exhilarating. I see the paths, dear sister, and I choose among them, as one chooses among dresses for a ball. Sometimes I choose wrong, and that is part of the adventure. But at least I am choosing. At least I am not sleepwalking through this one precious life. As the afternoon light faded and the attic grew dark, Sarah realized something profound. The gift itself wasn't the problem. The problem was fear. Every Blackwood woman who'd suffered had suffered because she'd made choices based on fear. Fear of pain, fear of loss, fear of making mistakes. And every Blackwood woman who'd thrived had done so because she'd made choices based on desire, on what she actually wanted, regardless of the potential cost. Sarah carefully packed Eleanor's letter and a selection of journals into her bag. She left the attic the same way she'd entered, through the broken cellar door, and drove home through the gathering dusk. Her studio apartment felt smaller than usual, cramped and suffocating, and she realized that she'd been living a life of fear too. The safe job, the isolated existence, the refusal to take risks or pursue dreams, all of it was a form of hiding. She'd been given an extraordinary gift, and she'd been treating it like a curse. But what if she could learn to use it differently? What if she could look at the possible futures not as prophecies to optimize around, but as information to help her understand what she truly wanted? That night, Sarah couldn't sleep. She lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, and thought about her life. The visions had been getting stronger, which meant she'd have to make a choice soon, surrender the gift or learn to live with it. But before she could make that choice, she needed to understand something fundamental. What did she actually want? Not what was safest, not what would disappoint the fewest people, not what made the most logical sense, but what did her deepest self desire? She got out of bed and sat at her small desk, pulling out a notebook. She began to write, not a plan or a list, but simply an exploration. If I could have any life, what would it look like? The words poured out of her. She wrote about wanting to write fiction, stories that mattered, that touched people's hearts. She wrote about wanting deep connections, chosen family, love that was real and challenging and transformative. She wrote about wanting to travel, to see landscapes that took her breath away, to stand in places of ancient beauty, and feel connected to something larger than herself. She wrote about wanting courage, about wanting to be the kind of person who made bold choices and lived with the consequences without regret. And as she wrote, she realized that the gift, the visions of possible futures, could actually help her get there. Not by showing her which path was safest, but by showing her which choices aligned with her desires and which didn't. The visions could be a compass, not a cage, but she also realized something else. She wasn't ready yet. She'd spent 32 years living small, playing it safe, hiding from her own potential. She couldn't just flip a switch and suddenly become brave. She needed help. She needed guidance. She needed to understand this gift fully before she could decide whether to keep it or surrender it, which meant she needed to find other Blackwood women. According to Eleanor's letter, the gift appeared in the family line across generations. Somewhere out there, Sarah had cousins, distant relatives, other women who carried this same burden and blessing, and she needed to find them. The gathering. Sarah's search for living Blackwood descendants began the next morning with a genealogy website and a strong pot of coffee. She'd barely slept, her mind racing with questions and possibilities. The estate sale was starting tomorrow, which meant she had limited time to explore the Blackwood house further. But she also couldn't just break in again. She'd gotten lucky yesterday, but pushing that luck seemed foolish. Instead, she focused on the paper trail, using the documents she'd found in the attic. Birth certificates, marriage licenses, family Bibles with handwrit on genealogies. She began constructing a family tree. Eleanor Blackwood had married Samuel Thornton, the banker's son she'd regretted choosing. They'd had 4 children: Margaret, who'd wanted to be a physician, Thomas, Elizabeth, and Catherine. Margaret had married and had 3 daughters. Thomas had died young, in his 20s, from appendicitis. Elizabeth had never married, but had adopted 2 children. Catherine had married and moved to California, having 5 children of her own. Sarah traced the lines forward, through marriages and births and deaths, through name changes and geographic dispersals. The Blackwood line had spread across the country, descendants in California, Oregon, Illinois, Florida, even one branch that had moved to Canada. And as she traced the female lines, she began to find something interesting: patterns. Every few decades, in various branches of the family, there were women who'd never married, or who'd married very late, or who'd made unusual career choices for their time periods, women who'd become doctors when that was nearly impossible, women who'd joined convents, women who'd traveled alone to foreign countries, women who'd founded businesses or written books or devoted themselves to social causes. These could have been coincidences, outliers that appeared in any large family tree. But Sarah didn't think so. She thought these were the ones who'd had the gift and had chosen to use it to pursue their truest desires, regardless of social expectations. She also found the other pattern: women who'd died young, or who'd been institutionalized for nervous conditions, or who'd become recluses, the ones who'd been broken by the gift, paralyzed by it, driven mad by seeing too many possible futures and being unable to choose among them. By late afternoon, Sarah had identified 17 living women who were direct descendants of Eleanor Blackwood through the female line. She stared at the list of names and addresses, her heart pounding. These were her relatives, her family, people who might understand what she was going through. But how could she contact them? She couldn't just call them up and say, "Hi, we're related. And by the way, do you happen to have psychic visions of multiple timelines?" They'd think she was insane, or trying to scam them somehow. She needed a more subtle approach. She needed an excuse to reach out that wouldn't immediately make her sound like a lunatic. The estate sale. That was it. She could contact them about the estate sale, about the family history preserved in the Blackwood house, about the possibility of reclaiming family heirlooms before they were sold to strangers. It was a legitimate reason for contact, and it might open the door to deeper conversations. Sarah spent the rest of the day crafting careful emails. She explained that she was a distant relative, true, that she'd discovered the Blackwood estate was being liquidated, true, and that she thought other family members might want to know about the sale and the historical documents she'd found, also true. She included her phone number and email address and sent the messages off into the void, not expecting much. But within an hour she got her first response, then another, then 3 more. By evening she'd heard from 9 of the 17 women on her list, and the responses ranged from politely interested to intense, almost desperately grateful. One woman, Lydia Blackwood Chen, who lived in San Francisco, wrote, "I've been looking for other family members for years. I have so many questions about our ancestry. Can we talk on the phone? I'm free anytime." Another, Rebecca Thorne, nee Blackwood, from Chicago, wrote, "You have no idea how much this email means to me. I felt so alone with certain experiences. I'd love to connect." Sarah's hands were shaking as she read the responses. Certain experiences. They knew. Some of them, at least, knew about the gift. She called Lydia first, not sure what to expect. The phone rang twice before a warm, slightly breathless voice answered. "Sarah? Is this Sarah Mitchell?" "Yes, hi, thank God you reached out. I've been seeing things my whole life, and I thought I was losing my mind." Do you have it too, the visions?" Sarah felt tears spring to her eyes. Yes, I have them. They started about 6 months ago." 6 months? Oh, honey, you must be terrified. Mine started when I was 13, and I've been dealing with them for 23 years. It gets easier, I promise, but only if you understand what's happening and learn to work with it instead of fighting it. They talked for 3 hours. Lydia explained that she'd grown up knowing she was different, seeing multiple futures branch off from every decision. Her parents had taken her to psychiatrists, who diagnosed everything from ADHD to early-onset schizophrenia. She'd been medicated throughout her teenage years, but the medications didn't stop the visions. They just made her too foggy to process them properly. When she was 18, she'd stopped taking the meds and started keeping a journal, documenting the visions and their outcomes. Over the years, she developed a system for working with the gift. She'd learned to identify which visions were most likely to manifest based on the vividness of the details and the emotional intensity of the experience. She'd learned to use the visions as information, not instruction, and most importantly, she'd learned to trust her gut, to make choices based on what felt right, even when the visions showed her potentially painful outcomes. "The thing is," Lydia explained, "the visions aren't actually showing you the future. They're showing you possibilities based on your current trajectory. But you can always choose differently in the moment. The future isn't fixed. It's fluid, responsive, constantly being created by your choices and everyone else's choices. The gift just gives you a preview of likely paths based on current conditions. But they feel so real," Sarah said. "I saw an entire lifetime with someone I just met, years and years of detailed experiences. How can that not be the actual future? Because consciousness is more complex than we usually acknowledge. Part of you, maybe your subconscious, maybe something deeper, is incredibly good at pattern recognition and projection. It takes all the information available about a person, a situation, a choice, and it extrapolates outward. It's not magic, exactly. It's more like quantum intuition. You're perceiving probability clouds, possible timelines that could emerge from current conditions. But the act of perceiving them changes them. The act of choosing changes them." This made a kind of sense to Sarah. It was less supernatural than she'd feared, but still extraordinary. "Have you ever thought about surrendering the gift? I found a letter from one of our ancestors, Eleanor Blackwood, and she described a ritual for letting it go." There was a long pause. "Yes," Lydia finally said. "I've thought about it a lot, especially when I was younger and the visions were overwhelming. But I've come to see the gift as part of who I am. It shaped my life in profound ways. I'm a quantum physicist. I study parallel universes and probability theory. I don't think that's a coincidence. The gift gave me a framework for understanding reality that most people don't have access to. It's made my life richer, more intentional, more aware. But doesn't it make everything harder? Knowing all the possible outcomes, sometimes. But it also makes everything more precious. I make choices knowing exactly what I'm choosing and what I'm giving up. I live with less regret because I understand that every path contains loss. There's no perfect choice. There's only the choice you make and how you live with it afterward." Sarah thought about this, about Eleanor and Margaret, and all the Blackwood women who'd been paralyzed by the burden of too much knowledge, but also about Prudence and Constance, and apparently Lydia, women who'd turned the gift into a source of power and intentionality. "I want to learn," Sarah said. "I want to understand how to use this properly. Can you help me?" "Absolutely. But you should know, you're not the only one looking for help. I've been in touch with a few other Blackwood descendants over the years. There are probably more who have the gift but don't know what it is, or think they're just crazy. We should gather them, compare experiences, build a support network. We could help each other." And so, over the next 2 weeks, Sarah became the center of an impromptu gathering of Blackwood women. Lydia helped her reach out to the others, Rebecca from Chicago had the gift and had been struggling with it alone for years. Elena Blackwood from Portland had experienced it sporadically, but had convinced herself it was just an overactive imagination. Grace Thorne Blackwood from Florida had surrendered the gift in her 20s and was willing to talk about what that had been like. They decided to meet in person at the Blackwood estate before the sale. Sarah contacted the estate lawyer and explained that she was a Blackwood descendant and that several family members wanted to view the property one final time before it was sold. The lawyer, perhaps moved by the request or perhaps just eager to avoid complications, agreed to give them access for one afternoon. On a Saturday in early April, 6 women gathered in the Blackwood Mansion's library. They ranged in age from 24 to 68. Some looked like they could be sisters, sharing Eleanor's dark hair and sharp cheekbones. Others had married into different ethnic backgrounds, creating beautiful combinations of features. But all of them shared something less visible, an intensity in their eyes, a quality of attention that suggested they were seeing more than the surface of things. Sarah had spent days preparing for this meeting. She'd organized all the historical documents she'd found, creating a timeline of the gift's appearance across generations. She'd made copies of Eleanor's letter for everyone, and she'd prepared a space in the library with comfortable chairs arranged in a circle, coffee and tea and snacks, tissues for what she suspected might be an emotional afternoon. They introduced themselves one by one. Lydia, the quantum physicist from San Francisco, 41 years old, who'd been living with the visions for 28 years. Rebecca, a high school teacher from Chicago, 36 years old, whose visions had started in her late 20s and had nearly destroyed her marriage before she learned to manage them. Elena, a graphic designer from Portland, 29 years old, who'd been having sporadic visions since childhood, but had never taken them seriously. Grace, a retired nurse from Florida, 68 years old, who'd surrendered the gift at age 26 and hadn't regretted it. Maya, a graduate student in philosophy from Boston, 24 years old, whose visions had just started a few months ago, like Sarah's. And finally, Vivian, a successful tech entrepreneur from Seattle, 53 years old, who'd built her entire career on insights gained from the visions. "I want to start by reading you something," Sarah said, and she read Eleanor's letter aloud. By the time she finished, several women were crying. Maya, the youngest, was shaking. "That's exactly what it's like," Maya whispered. "Exactly. I thought I was going insane. Last week I had a vision about whether to accept a job offer or stay in graduate school, and I saw 10 years of consequences for each choice, and I couldn't move for an hour afterward. I just sat there paralyzed, unable to process it all." "That's the trap," Vivian said, her voice firm but kind. "The paralysis. That's what destroys us." I went through that phase too, when the visions first started. I was 21, and suddenly every decision felt impossibly weighted. Should I take this class or that one? Should I go to this party or stay home? And each choice branched into these elaborate future scenarios, and I couldn't handle it. I dropped out of college. I moved back in with my parents. I barely left my room for 6 months. "What changed?" Sarah asked. "I got angry," Vivian said simply. "I got angry at being powerless. I got angry at this gift that was supposed to make me special but was actually making me weak. And I decided that if I was going to see all these possible futures, I might as well use that information. So I started experimenting. I'd make small choices deliberately, take the red shirt instead of the blue one, order coffee instead of tea, and then I'd observe what actually happened versus what the vision showed me. And I realized something crucial. The visions were probabilistic, not deterministic. They showed me likely outcomes, but I could always influence those outcomes by making unexpected choices, by changing my responses to situations, by being more intentional than the vision assumed I'd be. "Can you give an example?" Elena asked. "Sure. When I was 25, I had a vision about starting a business. I saw 2 main timelines. In one, I started the business and failed within 2 years, going into debt and damaging my credit. In the other, I played it safe, kept my corporate job, and climbed the ladder slowly, retiring comfortably, but never really feeling fulfilled. The visions were very clear. The business failure timeline showed me making specific mistakes, underpricing my services, hiring the wrong people, overextending too quickly. So I decided to do something the visions hadn't accounted for. I started the business, but deliberately avoided the mistakes I'd seen. I priced my services higher, took longer to hire, grew more slowly. And it worked. I created a third timeline that the original visions hadn't shown me because it required me to act on the information I'd gained from seeing the failure timeline. Rebecca leaned forward. But doesn't that prove the visions are just projections, not actual futures? I think they're both, Lydia interjected. In quantum mechanics, we talk about superposition, particles existing in multiple states simultaneously until observed. I think that's what we're experiencing. All these futures exist as potentials, as quantum possibilities, until our choices collapse them into a single actuality. We're not seeing one true future. We're seeing the probability wave of possible futures. And yes, that means we can influence which one manifests. Grace, who'd been quiet until now, spoke up. I surrendered the gift because I didn't want that responsibility. 36 years ago, I was a young nurse, seeing visions of patient outcomes, and it was tearing me apart. I'd see that a patient was going to crash in 3 hours if I didn't catch an early warning sign. I'd see that a medication error would happen unless I was extra vigilant. And yes, I saved lives because of it. But I also saw things I couldn't prevent. Patients who were going to die no matter what I did, and I had to live with knowing their deaths were coming. It was too much. So I did Eleanor's ritual. I went to the ocean at dawn and I spoke the names of all the lives I'd never live, all the people I'd never be, and I let it go. Do you regret it? Maya asked, her voice small. Grace smiled sadly. Sometimes. Not often, but sometimes. There's a flatness to life now that wasn't there before. I make choices like everyone else does, with partial information and hope, and there's a peace in that, a simplicity. But there's also a sense that I'm moving through the world half blind. I don't know if the choices I've made are the ones I would have made if I'd kept the gift. I don't know if the life I've lived is the one I truly wanted, or just the one that happened, but I'm okay with that uncertainty. For me, that's better than the constant weight of knowing. They talked for hours, sharing stories, comparing experiences, trying to understand the gift's mechanics and its implications. Some patterns emerged. The gift seemed to activate during times of transition, adolescence, early adulthood, major life changes. For some women, like Lydia, it came on gradually and stayed constant. For others, like Elena, it was sporadic, appearing only during major decisions. No one knew why it appeared in some Blackwood women and not others, or why it sometimes skipped generations. The vision's accuracy varied. For near-term futures, hours or days away, they were often quite accurate. For long-term futures, years or decades, they were more like probability clouds, showing general trajectories rather than specific details. And all the visions could be influenced by choices made after seeing them, creating feedback loops and recursive complexities. The emotional impact was significant for all of them. Even Vivian and Lydia, Hode learned to work with the gift productively, described periods of depression, anxiety, and existential crisis. The burden of knowing too much, of seeing all the paths not taken, was real and heavy. As the afternoon light faded, Sarah asked the question that had been on her mind since finding Eleanor's letter. What do we do with this? Now that we found each other, now that we understand what's happening, what do we do? Vivian spoke first. We support each other. We build a network, a community. We share what we've learned. We make sure no Blackwood woman ever has to go through this alone again. Lydia added, we document everything. We create resources, guides for managing the visions, techniques for making choices, frameworks for understanding the gift. We turn our experiences into wisdom that can help future generations. Rebecca said quietly, we make choices, we stop hiding. We use this gift or surrender it, but we don't let it paralyze us. We honor Eleanor's message. We live our lives fully, whatever that means for each of us. And Maya, the youngest, who'd been listening intently, said something that resonated with all of them. We forgive ourselves. For the choices we make and the ones we don't. For the lives we live and the ones we leave behind. We practice the thing Eleanor never learned. How to love the life we're in without being haunted by the lives we're not. They decided to meet regularly, to create a support network. Lydia volunteered to set up a secure online forum where they could share experiences and ask for advice. Vivian offered to fund research into the gift's neurological and psychological aspects. Maybe there were scientists who could help them understand what was happening in their brains. Grace agreed to document the surrender ritual in detail, so any Blackwood woman who wanted to let go of the gift would know exactly how to do it. And Sarah, who'd brought them all together, volunteered to continue researching their family history, to find more Blackwood women who might be struggling with the gift alone, to build a comprehensive genealogy and historical record. As they prepared to leave the mansion for the last time, Sarah felt something shift inside her. She'd come to this place 2 weeks ago feeling lost and frightened, cursed with an inexplicable ability that made her question her sanity. But she was leaving with a family, a purpose, and a choice. She still had to decide whether to keep the gift or surrender it, but now she understood that either choice could be right, depending on what she truly wanted. The gift wasn't the curse. The curse was believing there was only one correct path, one right answer, one way to live a good life. That night, back in her apartment, Sarah made a list, not of pros and cons, not of logical arguments for or against keeping the gift, but a list of desires, of dreams, of the things that made her feel most alive. Writing, creating stories that mattered, connecting deeply with others, living courageously, choosing love over fear. And then she looked at the gift honestly. How could it help her pursue these desires? The visions could show her the consequences of different paths, but they couldn't tell her which path would make her happiest. Only she could know that. Only she could choose. She thought about Derek, the accountant she'd fled from when the visions overwhelmed her. She thought about Isabel, the photographer in the unlived timeline, the woman she'd never meet if she didn't make different choices. And she realized something simple but profound. The gift had shown her what she truly wanted. A creative, authentic life, love with someone who understood her completely, the courage to be herself. But the gift couldn't give her those things. Only her choices could. Only her willingness to reach for what she wanted, despite the fear, despite the risk of loss. Sarah sat down at her desk and pulled out her notebook. She began to write a story. Not about the Blackwood women, not about the gift, but about a librarian who discovers she can see multiple futures and has to decide what kind of life she wants to live. She wrote for hours, the words flowing like they hadn't in years, and she realized this was her answer. She wanted to keep the gift, not because it made her special or gave her an advantage, but because it had shown her who she really was and what she truly wanted. It had forced her to confront her own desires instead of sleepwalking through a safe, small life. But she would use it differently than Eleanor had, differently than Margaret. She would look at the visions as information, as possibilities, as inspiration. But she would make her choices based on desire, not fear, based on who she wanted to become, not what she wanted to avoid. And if she made mistakes, if she chose paths that led to pain or loss, she would forgive herself. She would remember that all paths contain joy and sorrow, meaning and emptiness, that the choosing itself is what matters. 3 months later, Sarah quit her job at the library. She'd seen multi-PLL futures for this choice, some where she struggled financially, others where her writing never found an audience, and yes, some where she succeeded beyond her wildest dreams. But she didn't choose based on which outcome was most likely or most comfortable. She chose based on what felt truest to herself. She enrolled in the creative writing program she'd been considering for years. She started submitting stories to literary magazines. She joined a queer writers group where she met people who understood the complexity of coming into your identity later in life. And 6 months after that, at a book reading in a small independent bookstore, she met a photographer named Morgan, with wild gray hair and a laugh like wind chimes. Morgan wasn't Isabel. The woman from the vision had been a composite, a possibility, not a prophecy. But Morgan was real and complicated and wonderful in ways Sarah's visions had never shown her. Their relationship unfolded in its own unique way, full of surprises and challenges and moments of transcendent connection that no vision could have predicted. Sarah still had the visions. They came during moments of decision, showing her possible paths, potential outcomes. But she'd learned to work with them instead of being paralyzed by them. She'd look at the visions with curiosity, noting what they showed her about her own desires and fears. And then she'd make her choice based on what called to her deepest self. She published her first short story a year after quitting the library job. It was about a woman who could see multiple futures and had to learn to live with that gift. The story won a small award and was anthologized. It didn't make her rich or famous, but it connected with readers who felt lost in their own lives, struggling with their own impossible choices. And Sarah kept researching the Blackwood family history. She found 12 more women with the gift, scattered across the country and the world. The network grew. They supported each other through crises and celebrations, shared techniques and wisdom, and slowly built a body of knowledge about how to live well with extraordinary perception. One day, Sarah received an email from a woman in New Zealand, a Blackwood descendant named Aria who just discovered she had the gift at age 19. She was terrified, overwhelmed, convinced she was losing her mind. Sarah spent an hour on a video call with her, sharing her own story, reading parts of Eleanor's letter, connecting Aria with the network of women who understood. "Does it get easier?" Aria asked, her face streaked with tears. "Yes," Sarah said honestly, "but not because the visions stop or become less intense. It gets easier because you learn that you're not alone. You learn that this gift, this burden, is also a responsibility and an opportunity. You get to see what most people can only imagine. You get to make choices with extraordinary awareness, and if you use that wisely, if you choose based on desire instead of fear, you can build a life that's richer and more intentional than you ever thought possible." "But what if I choose wrong?" Sarah smiled, thinking of Eleanor, of Margaret, of all the Blackwood women who'd struggled with this question. There is no wrong choice. There are only the choices you make and how you live with them afterward. Choose what you truly want, not what seems safest or easiest, and then love that choice, commit to it, live it fully. That's the secret that took our ancestors generations to learn, and I'm passing it to you now. After the call ended, Sarah sat in her apartment, no longer a studio above an Indian restaurant, but a sunny one-bedroom she shared with Morgan and their 2 cats. She could see the ocean from the window. She could hear Morgan in the next room, editing photographs and humming to herself. On Sarah's desk were her notebook and laptop, a new story half-written, and a framed photograph of the 6 Blackwood women who'd gathered in the mansion library that first time. She thought about the choice she'd made, to keep the gift, to pursue writing, to open herself to love and risk, and the beautiful uncertainty of life. She thought about the paths she hadn't taken, the lives she'd never live. And for the first time since the visions began, she felt no regret, no haunting by the unlived, because she'd learned the lesson Eleanor had tried so hard to teach. The gift wasn't about seeing the future. It was about understanding the present, about knowing your own heart well enough to choose what truly mattered to you, about having the courage to commit to those choices fully, without the constant backward glance at the road not taken. Sarah picked up her pen and returned to her story. She wrote about women who saw too much and learned to live anyway, who made choices and lived with them, who built lives of meaning out of the raw material of possibility. And in doing so, she honored Eleanor's legacy. She broke the curse that had haunted Blackwood women for generations, not by surrendering the gift, but by transforming it from a burden into a blessing, from a curse into a compass, from a weight into wings. The letter from 1888 had changed everything, but not because it told Sarah what to do, because it showed her that she had always had the power to choose her own life. She'd just been too afraid to use it. Now, finally, she was choosing, fully, courageously, without regret, and that made all the difference. The story of the Blackwood women continues in each choice they make, each life they live fully, each moment they choose desire over fear. Eleanor's letter lives on, passed from hand to hand, generation to generation, reminding us all that we are the authors of our own lives, and that the choosing itself, not the outcome, is what makes us human.